Ханым-ханым мен мырзалар, орындарыңызға отыруларыңызды сұраймыз. Рахмет. Дамы и господа, просим вас занять свои места в зале. Спасибо. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats in the hall. Thank you.
Dear forum participants, we invite to the stage Mr. Pedro Gurrola-Perez with a case presentation on the topic Building Efficient Risk Management within the PFMI framework. Please welcome.
So thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much to the WFC for this invitation. It's really an honor and a privilege to be here with you. I'm Pedro Gurrola-Perez. I'm head of research at the World Federation of Exchanges. Before this, I spent 6 years at the Bank of England, leading a research team on financial market infrastructures. And my background is quantitative. I'm a mathematician, so I naturally gravitated into questions around risk modeling. And that's the topic I would like to talk with you, to discuss with you today. The title of the conference is about the PFMI's An Efficient Risk Framework. As you know, the PFMIs have many concepts which are open-ended, which involve trade-offs. For example, extreme but plausible. Extreme but plausible is a phrase that we find at the PFMIs around 40 times. And it's often the question, what is extreme but plausible? How do we get into that space? How do we judge whether something is really extreme and it's effectively something plausible to happen in the case, for example, of scenarios for stress testing? And this, of course, there's a lot of expert judgment involved in that type of decisions, but it's important, or it could be useful also and helpful to have some quantitative way of approaching this type of trade-offs. And it's full of trade-offs, the PFMI. So the talk today hopefully will help a little bit of, will provide a little bit of a quantitative way of tackling this issue and looking at efficiency in terms of these open-ended concepts. And the efficiency will depend very much on the markets, different markets. For different markets, for example, extremely plausible would mean something, and for other markets would mean a different thing. Depends on the asset class, depends on the size of market, the type of market, etc. So that's the topic of the talk. It's about how within the PFMIs these concepts, open concepts, and these trade-offs can be looked at from a more quantitative perspective. So let me start with, well, I won't talk much about the PFMIs because we all know it's been more than a decade from that. We've all dealt with that. Perhaps the only important thing or the relevant thing here is that although my talk will focus on some CCP type of examples, it applies in many cases equally to payment systems and CSDs. And what is more important is that they are principle-based. In some cases, like the European Union, the PFMIs have been implemented in a more prescriptive fashion. EMIR is implementation of some part of the PFMIs, but it's prescriptive in many cases where the PFMIs remain principle-based. And the adoption has been widespread. And this is the latest compliance report from CPMI OSCO about the implementation of PFMIs. They have been fully implemented widely, and there are some places where they're still ongoing, the implementation. In some cases, the assessment is incomplete. But in any case, it's something that depends very much on the market where we are, but we have a widespread adoption of this. And in the case of risk, there are different principles of the PFMIs which apply to CSDs, CCPs, and settlement systems. And you can think of the many things that fall into each one of these categories. The examples I will be using are mainly from around procyclicality, which applies both for collateral haircuts and for initial margins from CCPs. But it could be applied in any of the different principles. The fact that there are principles is also helpful because there are different structures around the world. Not everyone has a CCP. So in many cases, the clearing is done by the CSD. And within that space, there may be different type of arrangements to manage counterparty credit risk. In some cases, there's a settlement guarantee fund. In some cases, trades are pre-funded. So the PFMIs are able to incorporate or to address the different structures that we find in different jurisdictions. And different jurisdictions may also be at different stages in the implementation of PFMIs for many, many reasons. But I think there's a general consensus that meeting the PFMIs is very beneficial in terms of not only the robustness and resilience and safety of the system, but also in terms of what is the message to the outside world in terms of compliance and maturity of the market. Well, going into detail, as I said, it's a principle-based framework, and it has many of these concepts which are open-ended in the sense that there's no concrete reference to how to meet that particular concept. So, we can think about conservative, that's a typical example, conservative haircuts. Principle 5, collateral, it talks always, all the time about prudent but practical, to the extent practical and prudent, etc. So in the case, for example, of prudent, practical and prudent is referred to 6 times, and as I mentioned at the start, the idea of extreme but plausible is mentioned around 40 times. And if you think about what concepts we are looking at, when we talk about extreme, we're talking about something that we have to also take into account the cost of being extreme. So if I'm thinking about a scenario for stress testing, the more extreme the scenario, probably the more costly it will be for the participants to meet or to cover that risk. And on the other side, if we talk about plausible, we're talking about uncertainty, which implies some measure of probability. So the idea of what I'm going to present now is how to quantify these two parts of the equation. In other words, we need to make the trade-offs operational in some way to have some quantitative measure that can help us take the right decisions. Of course, we all work within constraints. If we're talking about margin, for example, we have the 99% coverage that is the basic coverage required for margin models. In Europe, it's even goes further for OTC derivatives. It's 99.5, and many CCPs operate with higher constraints. But we need to measure the efficiency, and we need to take into account the uncertainty that surrounds any of this. So when we talk about efficiency, in our case, the most simple example comes from physics, well, at least for me, which is just a measure of how much work we have a machine, how much work we get when we have an energy input. So it's always a comparison between the output and the input. Interestingly, in physics, one of the most efficient machines is one of the most simplest, which is the bicycle. If we look at risk in our context, well, it's certainly measuring how much risk I am mitigating and how much is costing me to do that. That's a very simple measure of efficiency, and it can be applied in very different contexts from, within payments, within CSDs, within CCPs. It's also interesting to realize that in general, the more risk we want to reduce in the left-hand side, the more costly that will be. But that's not the only thing we want to look at. We may also want to look at how much risk we can reduce per unit of cost. In other words, we look at the marginal efficiency, which is what you see on the right-hand side. So we have a different type of curve. On the right-hand side, we have a curve that decreases very quickly and then stabilizes for some time, which means that it's probably not efficient to spend money in mitigating risk when we are on the right-hand side, on the more horizontal part of the curve, because then the decrease in risk is very small compared to the cost that I have to invest in that. It's only on the gray area that seems to be the optimal place to to invest in my mitigation strategy. So I'm going to give a particular example of these concepts, how they apply in the case of procyclicality. My preference has always been working with CCPs, but you can have also, the procyclicality is a concept that applies in the case of CSDs, for example, in the haircuts of collateral when there's a lending service, etc. So the first thing we have to do is to measure it. If you think about the definition of procyclicality in the PFMIs, the concern in general from the regulators is that if you have a procyclical initial margin, for example, or a procyclical haircut model, then that means that in a situation of stress, your margins will go up, your haircuts will also increase. That will require more collateral from the participants, which at a time of stress will probably only feed a negative loop, and increase the stress in the system. So from the perspective of the regulator, procyclicality has been at the top of the agenda for quite a while, and you will see it coming and going. Every time when we have the COVID crisis, for example, there was a new, renewed interest in procyclicality from the side of the regulators. And the definition is there, and you can see from the definition that it's very much linked to the idea of trying to mitigate any negative feedback loops from a financial stability perspective. There's no practical definition of procyclicality, unfortunately. We don't know exactly how to measure that, and there are different measures that have been proposed, but what is clear is that whatever we do with procyclicality, we have to mitigate it to the extent practical and prudent, and that's the part that becomes less clear. So the measures, the intuition of procyclicality is basically you have two cycles. It could be the economic cycle and some financial cycle, and you don't want those, or you would prefer those to be not moving at the same time, because if they move at the same time, then that's when the feedback loops generate. But if you try to think about measures, well, there are different ways, and in the academic literature and the regulators have proposed different ways of measuring procyclicality. Not long ago, it was the CPMI, OSCO, BIS working group on margin methodologies came out with a new measure of procyclicality. But essentially, what you're trying to measure is how much the margin or the collateral haircut jumps when there is a stress. So how responsive is your model to the increase in risk in the system? You have to admit that risk models are made to respond to risk. So there's always there's some procyclicality involved. There's no way of avoiding that. But what we're trying to avoid is that jump or that responsiveness is too much, to the extent that that's possible. So the trade-off is very clear in this case, because you have, on the plot you can see two margin models, one in red and one in yellow. I'm color blinded, so hopefully those are the colors. But you can more or less distinguish. You have a series of returns of a fictitious historical portfolio, and you have two margin models, one that is more reactive than the other. So clearly the one that is more reactive is the yellow one, I think, or green. And you can see jumping, every time there is a jump in the returns, it jumps more. And the other one is more stable. So the one is less procyclical, but it's more costly, because most of the time it's higher, which means that if I am applying that model to measure to call margins from a member, the member will be posting a higher amount of margin all the time. So that's a cost, that's collateral cost. So I have to decide which one of these two models are most efficient, and perhaps some of them also gives a better coverage than the other. So we have the three variables that I have to optimize, and they are not compatible. So if I go to the less responsive model, I will probably have to increase margin, so that would be costly, and I will probably lose some of the benefits of a good coverage of the model. So there are three elements that I cannot enjoy at the same time. And the other thing I want to bring is the uncertainty element. Here is an example, and this is from a paper that we published some time ago. So it's a COVID crisis. So you see on the left-hand side is the real returns from the Standard & Poor's. On the right-hand side is the same thing, but I just changed the returns in 2 days. So I just invented 2 days returns in February. And the outcome of this is that the procyclicality judgment changes completely. We have on the last graph on the right, there are three models, and the red one of them corresponds, one of them is applied to the real case, another one is to the hypothetical case, and I can see that the situation reverts for when we compare one model to the third one, which means that my decision as a risk management decision maker depends also on the path, on the actual historical sequence of events, but that's random. So, conclusion, I need also to take into account uncertainty. And this is very much what happens in weather forecasting. Yeah, I cannot base, for example, on one historical path, make a single prediction for the future, but my prediction has to take into account that there are many elements that can vary, and therefore I don't have a single prediction, but I have a probability distributions or a wide series of outputs, and then I have to decide if I take the average, for example, I probably need to know how much around that average my prediction can be wrong, so I can have a more informed decision of whether I should take my umbrella tomorrow, if it's going to rain or not, etc. I mean, this is mostly in the case of, for example, hurricanes or large climatology events. So if I do the same in our space, what I'll do in this simple graph is I have a model, I have a floor, I'm adding a floor to the model. The floors are one of the things that regulators like to mitigate procyclicality. So the idea is that if you increase the floor, of course, if there's a shock, the jump in your margin model should be smaller because you're already on a high place. So you don't allow your margin to go too low so that when there's a shock, the jump is not too big. Of course, if you increase the floor to a very high level, you won't have any jumps, but the cost will be unbearable for the participants to keep margin or to use collateral haircuts at those levels. So certainly the floor helps, and at some point it stops helping. So you can see on the right-hand side, there's a graph where I show how this happens. So the blue line, the continuous line, is my procyclicality reduction, and the red line is my increasing costs. And I'm moving from left to right by increasing the floor. So as I increase the floor, as I expect, my procyclicality decreases, but my costs increase. And as in the example that I gave before, the procyclicality decreases at different rates. So if I'm very much on the left-hand side, really, my floor is not doing anything. It's more or less in the middle where I see procyclicality being reduced significantly, and then the reduction becomes again marginal. My cost on the other side increase all the time. The cost of margin becomes more and more, it's more and more larger. And you also see some dotted lines which show me the probability, because this is a probability distribution, so I have the 5 and the 95% quantiles, which give me a sense of how much wrong my prediction could be around my numbers. So the price is not only, or the cost is not only the red line, but also it can vary between these two dotted lines. And that helps me take a decision. What is also interesting is to think about, well, this is simulation with 10,000 paths. So the question is, well, I know the average, those are the blue and red line. Is that enough? Well, I recommend looking in more detail. So here I have, for one level of the floor, all the specific outcomes I get in terms of cost reduction and procyclicality reduction. So each one of these dots is the outcome of one simulation. Maybe you can see there's an asterisk, a black asterisk near the corner of the graph. That's where the average sits. So that's the average that we saw in the previous graph. But what's interesting when we do this analysis is that you have a lot of dots on the top of the graph, which these represent scenarios where the floor was costly, but the procyclicality reduction was 0. And that's also a good message for the regulators, and with this I will finish. I've been in many, when I was at the bank, I know this type of conversations, and it's always, desirable from the perspective of the regulator to have an answer which is the average. That the point tells me that I will reduce procyclicality by X% if I increase the floor to X%. And what this deeper analysis shows is that we have to be more cognizant of the uncertainty of any type of forecast and the probability that it may, in some states of the universe, even this type of model, which is giving me a good reduction on average, will give me 0 reduction of procyclicality, and I will still be paying some costs. So the world is uncertain, and that has to be part of the story, which is, in some sense, what is implicit in this type of phrases like extreme but plausible. No? You have extreme scenarios, but they have to be plausible, and the cost has to be part of the equation. So that's what I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Mr. Pedro Gurrola-Perez, thank you. Please let us give you some small present. And let's take a picture. Thank you. Thank you so much. We start 4th panel session on the topic, establishing effective business continuity processes to mitigate risks in the post-trade industry. This panel will delve into best practices for designing and implementing robust business continuity and disaster recovery frameworks that mitigate risks arising from operational disruptions, cyber threats, natural disasters, and other unforeseen events. Panel session moderator, Director of Financial Market Infrastructure, Thomas Murray Panagiotis Kiziris, and all of the panelists. You are welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Panagiotis Kiziris. I'm head of the FMI team at Thomas Murray. Thomas Murray is a risk consultancy and technology firm based in London, which has for over 30 years provided risk assessments on FMIs and particularly CSDs. First of all, I want to say a big thank you to WFC for inviting me to moderate my very first panel, and to my esteemed colleagues for welcoming me warmly. So I'm delighted to welcome you to today's discussion on the topic of business continuity management. We really couldn't have asked for a better group of panelists. They represent a very diverse group of CSDs. I think we've covered all the regions this side of the Atlantic, and each of them are facing their own kind of unique risks. But also we have representation from members, which brings an invaluable perspective to the conversation. So let me very briefly introduce the panelists. So I'm joined by Mark Jem, Chairman of ECSDA and Chair of the Risk Committee at Clearstream. Beverley Furman, Head of Operations and Chains at Strate, which is the CSD in South Africa. Haruna Jalo-Waziri, CEO of the Nigerian CSD CSCS. Annie Makaryan, CEO of the CSD in Armenia. Tarawneh, CEO of the CSD in Jordan, and Mikhail Novoselov, I'm sorry, apologies for the pronunciation, Executive Director of Freedom Brokers. So welcome everyone. Just a few words before we begin with the questions. So it's business continuity, which is the topic of today's panel. Obviously, it's not a new term. It has been around, it has been part of the operational risk vocabulary for decades, and I'm certain if I ask the esteemed panelists about their recovery time objectives or recovery point objectives, they would know them by heart and could recite them on the spot. So I would like today to take the conversation a step further. And instead of focusing only on business continuity, I think it's worthwhile to kind of broaden the lens to operational resilience and how FMIs should not only look at how they respond to incidents, but how they prevent, adapt, recover, and learn from incidents. And this is becoming more and more important in the current landscape, and as we'll hear in a minute, there are all sorts of new risks that compel us to look at business continuity as just a component of a wider operational resiliency framework, a more holistic approach of how CSDs adapt to incidents and how they view themselves within the wider financial system and the implications that they have. So I'll start with you, Sarah, if you don't mind, all the way to the end. So, as I mentioned, we're all aware of the necessity to develop and maintain programs and resources to ensure operational continuity. But could you kind of lead us off by helping to define what risks are we talking about, what risks our FMIs are facing when we think about it in an operational resilience context, and perhaps give more emphasis to how these risks have evolved over the last few years.
Okay, thank you, Panos. Good evening, everyone. Very good to be here with you. Thank you for the Kazakhstanian CSD, and thank you for the WFC for having us and providing us the ability to talk and to discuss about this very important topic, Panos actually, and everyone. When we talk about operational resilience, and that is a very wide, I would say, expression that all of us as CSDs and basically financial market institutions should be aware of how to tackle this term. So operational resilience, basically, it's talking about mitigating, as you mentioned, preventing, predicting, and most importantly, reacting to whatever risk factors CSDs or financial market institutions might be exposed to. And when we talk about risks, and I would like to just define certain types of risks, and I'm against defining a checklist for risks. This is I'm going to talk about that at the end. But talking about defining risks for CSDs, this is mainly, of course, we're all aware that there are conventional risks that we're exposed to as depositories, as clearing and settlement agencies. We're aware of that. However, what we should be aware of and very alert to is the way risks are evolving. So we can be talking about, for example, cybersecurity risks and threats. And this has been, it used to be looked at a certain point of time as an IT risk factor. However, it's not an IT risk factor. Today, it has become a more systemic risk that would affect the whole ecosystem. It could affect your resilience. It could affect the way you deal with your day-to-day businesses and operations. And we've seen many examples of that and how cybersecurity threats are becoming really, really more complex as days pass by, if not hours, of course. So this is something that has evolved over time, and it is still evolving, and we still need to find ways to deal with such risk factors. We could be talking about technology change. We could be talking about digital transformation. I mean, during the past 2 days, discussions have been going around how CSD businesses have evolved, how they can basically provide more services to the community, to the stakeholders, to the investors, how to develop your basic service core values and core operations. And this does not come without risks. So the more you evolve in your businesses and what you do on your day-to-day businesses and developments, the more you're exposed to a variety of risks that you were not initially aware of, or basically that it exists. We could be talking again about factors like interconnectedness, and this has been also mentioned during the many discussions over the panel discussions earlier. So interconnectedness between FMIs, between stakeholders, even third-party dependency. We all rely on infrastructure providers, we all rely on vendors, and this also should be looked as a risk factor that we need to consider, because whatever risk they would be exposed to, they could also disrupt our operations and our day-to-day businesses. But there's a factor that I would like to just touch base a little bit on, and I don't want to go into politics, but there is a very important aspect here. It's about geopolitical, I would say, disruptions or fragmentation. And we've seen that, and we will continue to see that the way I see it. Of course, I do hope from the bottom of my heart that it would end all over the world. However, we cannot just ignore the fact that geopolitical fragmentation is also exposing, I would say, new types of risks that we were not familiar to. And we've faced that. For example, in our region, we did face that. Of course, it did not cause disruptions in all jurisdictions. However, it did pose serious, I would say, serious factors hindering your way to provide your day-to-day businesses effectively. And this is something that should be monitored and looked at very closely. And the way I see it, and talking to you, panelists, being Thomas Murray, I do realize that you assess risk all over jurisdictions in different regions of the world. But I do believe that as I mentioned, as we evolve, risk is evolving as well. So, and this is not like a conventional checklist that you can just look at and try to face with whatever tools or mechanisms you might have. You have to be looking at risk factors and assessing also risk factors based on jurisdictions, based on certain types of, I would say, operations that entities provide. So it's not like a one-size-fits-all when you look at risk factors related to depositories, to CSDs, and as I mentioned, there are some risks that certain jurisdictions are exposed to whilst others are not. And this also involves, for example, weather conditions, physical risks that many jurisdictions might be also threatened by. The thing is, what I wanted to highlight here, importantly, is that again, it's not like you just do what you do once, for example, or periodically during 1 year. You have to always keep checking that risk checklist that you have to be able to predict and to be able to respond to whatever factors are evolving around you, regardless, be it, again, geopolitical, be it, and we've all seen the pandemic. I mean, we've all seen the pandemic when COVID did pose its disruptions on all our businesses all over the world. And well, the good thing about that is, or the positive factor about that, is whenever we're exposed to a new type of risk, well, it's basically, it provides us with more ability to predict and more ability to understand how to react to that risk factor most effectively. So I believe we all benefited from the COVID situation because we learned how to work from homes, we've learned how to work online, we've learned how to even cut our expenses to an extent where we can work remotely, we can work with effectiveness, how to rely on technology. I mean, last week I was in London, and just to mention that, you've all heard about the cyber threats that affected the airports in Brussels, Berlin, and Heathrow. I was there, and I was really glad to see that they did have a plan B. And from what I heard, not all airports, not everyone had a plan B. So plan B basically did involve going back to basics. So I literally watched them just going back to plan B, and they did work with the system to be able to perform their operations. Everyone was onboarded. I realized there was a delay, of course, but at the end of the day, they were able to do it, and they were able to perform their businesses. And for me, I was just looking, and it was really beneficial for me to understand that I do realize that we are evolving towards adopting new infrastructures, new technology change. However, we need always to be alert, to have like even conventional ways to provide businesses. I do realize that it might sound a little bit strange, but you might need it at a certain point of time. And I've seen that in many examples all over other jurisdictions and within our region in the Middle East. So that's what I really wanted to highlight, is how dynamic you are in performing your businesses, and most importantly, how dynamic this risk checklist is becoming. And it's becoming more and more complex and evolving as days pass by. So you need to just always, as CSDs and FMIs, you need to keep your alerted all over as days pass by, because it's not something that you can just face for one time only. It has to be revised, it has to be analyzed. Of course, I realize we're going to talk about many other risk factors as we speak on this panel today. So thank you, panelists.
Thank you, Sarah. No, very insightful comments, and I think you set the stage wonderfully for the rest of the discussion. Very thorough answer. You've covered many points. I take your point about being dynamic in designing your frameworks, but also all the new risks that you have to take into account, and obviously the risks that are posed by the interconnectedness we were talking earlier. But also your comment about one size doesn't fit everyone. So Mark, perhaps over to you. Representing here rather one of the largest infrastructure CSDs in Europe, an actual group of CSDs in Europe, what guidance can you give in terms of the key tenets or principles that organizations should take into account when designing and maintaining effective operational resilience plans?
I think I'd pick up on something that Sarah said, which is the ability to respond. So we heard earlier about extreme but plausible risks. But the truth is that when a risk crystallizes, it tends to be very unpredictable. It tends perhaps to have been predicted, or it may not have been predicted, but the effects are often unpredictable. And I always take as my starting point 9/11. So we in Clearstream, we lost our office in New York. It was in the second tower. And we thought that was the crisis we had. So there we were in the crisis committee, and we were saying, where is everyone? Who's logged on? Who's entered the office? Do we know who's alive? Etc. What we were actually dealing with was completely different. It was a liquidity crisis because of what happened to Bank of New York and the fact that they lost their primary and their secondary data center in the single event. But that was absolutely not visible to us. The other point arising from 9/11, which I think is relevant here, is, I'm certainly the oldest panelist by years, if not by experience. And before 9/11, a panel like this would have said, well, we've identified all of the scenarios of things that could possibly go wrong. And continuity plans in those days would just go on for meters of file large folders. And you would, if there's a bomb threat in building B, then you go to the folder and you say, what do I do if there's a bomb threat in building B? Or I have to move my staff to building C and switch production to data center D, and that's fine, I've done that. So after 9/11, we kind of realized that that was an extreme and implausible risk. So the key learning point I have there is expect the unexpected. Never believe that you know what kind of crisis you are going to have. And that was true of COVID. We all experienced that. We thought it was about, can we work from home? Do we have the laptops, et cetera, et cetera? But then we all know what happened. The volume, and we heard about it earlier, the behavior of asset prices, as there was this tremendous asset transformation in the market. Clearstream, for example, we've been arguing with our regulators for years. Should we scale our production to 1.8 or 1.9 times historic peak. That was the debate. We got 5 times historic peak with COVID because things went wrong. But no matter. So that knowing which category you're in is a big mistake. You never know which category you're in. And you have to be able to respond. And I think the key piece of advice we would give is make sure that you have a process that puts the decision makers, the information owners in the same room, and that they have the capacity to respond. Do not assume, oh, it's a cyber attack, so we need a cyber team. You don't know where that cyber attack is going to lead. Don't assume that because you've got a fire, that's it, your facility management team can sort that out. You don't know where that leads. Maybe it's a form of hostile attack. You have to keep all your options open. So the ability to respond and putting the emphasis in your resilience planning on command and control will be my key takeaways.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Mark. Very powerful example, if I may say so. And it's a fantastic segue for the question I want to ask Beverley. So Sarah mentioned the example of Heathrow the other day. Just the check-in system wasn't working, so they reverted to pen and paper. Then Mark went to the complete other extreme where you have a catastrophic event in the middle of the biggest financial center. So how does Strate, in this case, how do you address resilience in the context of a wide range of potential scenarios?
Good afternoon, everybody. Just firstly, thank you to KCSD and WFC for the invitation to speak. Maybe before I respond, just give you a little bit of context of Strate so that you understand what we solve for. Strate is the only operational CSD in South Africa. We have been appointed by 4 exchanges to settle their trades, although the one exchange has about 90-95% dominance, so most of the trades come through them. We also have a strategic partnership with Clearstream for a collateral management system, and then we have a link with Euroclear. So that's what we have to solve for if we say we want to be resilient. So an example of what Strate did is anybody who knows South Africa understands we are very challenged in terms of infrastructure, and our national electricity provider, Eskom, challenges us as people who live in South Africa because there is often load shedding where our electricity is just cut off. So about 3 years ago, load shedding was a daily event, and you did not know how long you would not have electricity for, but it was really geographically centered. So about 3 years ago, our regulators got very concerned about the frequency of load shedding and the extreme but very plausible scenario of a national-wide blackout. I believe Spain recently experienced something similar. But with a national blackout, you do not know how long you are going to be offline. So we were asked by our regulators to develop OCRM, O-C-A-R-M. And I was asked to speak about this last year in Turkey. And since then, we've actually simulated the event. But OCRM is an acronym for orderly closing and reopening of your markets. So our regulators understood the interconnectedness of our capital markets, that a CSD alone is not market resilience. They recognize that a CCP, an exchange, a CSD, are what they termed circuit breakers. If one of those entities shut down, it impacts the entire resilience of your capital markets. So we developed OCRM, which was a way that any one of our circuit breakers, CCP, CSD, or an exchange, if they were forced to shut down, how would that impact the entire resilience of the market? Akram went a step further. The brainstorming was related to a national blackout, of which you did not know when the lights were going to come on. They contacted all our telecommunication companies, and although we can stockpile diesel, they realized that our networks, our communication networks in a national blackout would only last 4 hours. If you've only got 4 hours and then there is no communication channels, you cannot email, you cannot WhatsApp, you cannot phone, you cannot communicate. What do you as an ecosystem do to protect investors, to protect issuers? So South Africa developed an Akram playbook. Strate was actually asked to chair the capital market stream because there was a banking and payment stream. There was an investment and insurance stream. And we actually, and it was not an April Fool's joke, on the 1st of April of this year, we actually were called into an off-site, undisclosed location where we were asked to simulate that event. How do you collectively shut down your financial markets in 4 hours? Then you sit and you wait. Are you offline for 24 hours, 7 days, 30 days? You don't know. But when the electricity is restored, how do you recover from that? And that is the true sense of resilience, is the definition of how do you withstand and recover in an extreme situation. And it's important what Mark said is we could brainstorm a national blackout, but it is very important to remain trigger agnostic, whether that's a blackout, whether it's war, whether it's cyber, whether it's a national disaster. Ensure that your resilience framework is trigger agnostic. Thank you.
Fascinating, Beverley. Thank you very much. I hope you never have to kind of experience it real life and just stay in the simulations, but it's fantastic that you are so well prepared.
And I just want to make one last point, and it speaks to Pedro's comments on the PFMI. And advice to my peers is it's not just important to have a resilience framework and a plan. In terms of the PFMI principles, you should test those and you should simulate them across your industry so that every role player knows, who do I phone? Who makes the decisions? What is my communication tree? And you should actually run a simulation of those events. Okay.
Good advice, I'd say. Thank you very much. Haruna, perhaps I can ask you now. It's a nice continuation from what Beverley was just saying. So how do you think we can address, FMIs can address the wider systemic risk of an increasingly interconnected market, like Sarah mentioned earlier, and realistically, what should be our expectations about managing those risks?
Thank you very much. As an African, I always like to tell a story, and that's how we learn. But before I tell that story, I'm going to have to speak about what Beverley said about power outages in South Africa. 3 years ago, I was in, I think it was TNF in South Africa, and we were in a hall, and the power went out. And I said, welcome to Lagos. Because in Nigeria, we have arguably 5,500 megawatts of power being generated, with a population of 220 million people. And you can imagine what kind of resilience we build to be able to have our communication infrastructure to go up, have our markets to be open, have our refineries to be producing, if you like, products for us to gear up the industry, the economy. So what am I saying about resilience? If you go to a Nigerian bank or a stockbroker firm or even our offices, you'd find that we have 4 or 5 layers of power resilience. First is the national grid. Second is probably 2 or 3 generators being powered by diesel. Third, you find there are batteries that probably have a 18-hour, if you like, capacity to run. And then, of course, we are adding now solar panels. So these are examples of how you find yourself in an environment that's challenging, but you build redundancies in these kind of situations where things don't happen. So when MTN is building a tower in Nigeria, it's putting a generator, apart from the national grid, a full tank of diesel of about 4,000 liters, a battery that will last about 6 hours, and in this case, most of the cell towers now have solar panels because the national grid doesn't work. Now, the story I want to tell is about, there's a company called RTX. It has a subsidiary called Collins Aerospace. For those of you who have flown into Kazakhstan through Europe, you must have seen the impact of Collins Aerospace. Between Monday and today, there has been outages in many of the airports in Europe. I know for sure Heathrow, Brussels, Dublin, and all that place. You go into check-in, they're checking you manually. So flights were canceled on Tuesdays, flights were delayed on Tuesdays because of one company called Collins Aerospace. Now, this is an example of how we are all interconnected, and one company could cause a damage to, or rather could cause, has an adverse effect in your operations. I left New York on Monday. I didn't get to Kazakhstan till about 2 hours ago. That's because of Collins. So everywhere I went, there was a delay in the flight, and the connecting flight was also missed. In terms of financial market infrastructures, because we are also very well interconnected, it's very important that the things that Sarah said, things that Mark said, and Beverley in terms of building resiliencies, simulating those scenarios that occur. But more importantly, I think for me, is having muscle memory. It's easy to write the policies, set the standards, and then also adopt them, but the day it happens, how do you react? You can only be able to react appropriately when you test, you practice, you simulate these things consistently, and you have that muscle memory so that when it happens, you are able to think appropriately, act appropriately, and by extension, be able to recover, because things will go wrong anyway. But it's how do we act when it goes wrong? What do we do when it goes wrong? And how do we recover? And how quickly do we recover without that much damage? So for me, those are the things that I look for in terms of what we look at resiliencies, especially in market infrastructures that we all operate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a very, very valid point. That's really what matters at the end of the day. How do you actually realistically respond in a situation, not just what's on paper? Ani, I'll come over to you and ask now. Haruna just mentioned the issues again at Heathrow about kind of that single point of vulnerability, which emphasizes the need to monitor and assess your third-party or even fourth-party providers. So FMIs are increasingly dependent on third-party vendors and service providers. So how do you factor in all these dependencies in your resilience plans? And even if you want more particularly on the cyber supply chain risk?
Thank you for the question. I think it is very actual and, let's say, burning for FMIs, because what we see there, except from Haruna's example, what we see more and more the FMIs are becoming more dependent on the third-party service providers because they are being more concentrated locally and even more internationally. So, and it's not only about the cyber threats or cyber security, it's about even the technology that the FMIs use. We can see internationally a few vendors which are not regulated somehow, but still they are the main vendors for the FMIs. Coming to the mitigation of the third-party dependencies, I want to highlight that the state-level regulations are very important because I think this is a risk that the FMIs cannot be left without the backup support of the regulators. This means the regulatory framework should somehow address and simplify those mitigations of those risks. In Armenia, as you may know, we don't have a particular framework such as DORA, which will touch upon the issues and the processes and the oversight of these types of vendors. Rather, we have a regulation which aims to meet certain ISO standards by the FMIs. But right now, our regulator is in the process of changing the laws and giving the powers to itself to oversight those companies. What can I say about our end? So at Depository, based on the best international practice, what exists in the currently in the region or globally, we have developed our internal methodology, which states certain phases or certain requirements towards factoring those risks from third-party dependencies. And one of the initial steps is the mapping of critical vendors. So how you identify them, how do you maintain proper information about them, how do you require certain reporting from them because you don't have it on a normative level, but you need a type of oversight towards them, and the most effective way is to have minimum contractual obligations for them to meet. For example, information sharing, for example, incident management or breach notifications. The other part is also ongoing due diligence and oversight over those vendors. So in our company, we do it on an annual basis. We evaluate their performance, the risks which can come from them. And most importantly, we are trying to be firm with the testings with them. So we have joint BCP tests with them, penetration tests, also engaging the regulator. So as a and we also have a non-formal information sharing environments towards towards the financial institutions, where we can share on not of course disclosing non-proper information, but again sharing basic information that can help others to better mitigate the risks. My conclusion or a sum up on this point will be that the challenge is that we are seeing the concentration. For example, in Armenia, there are certain vendors which provide technology services or software services, like 80% of the financial industry. We see even more the international ones that are part of it. So having the normative regulatory framework will help us to overcome risks there, because now it is left only on the negotiations with the partner, and you may have the risk that he will simply refuse you providing these types of services if you are insisting on something. Yeah? So having the regulatory backup is important, and this will institutionalize the requirements that there are in place and are important. I think that's it from my side.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Annie. Mikhail, actually, based on what Annie just touched upon, involving members, responsibility towards members, so you being a member of a CSD, what do you think market participants like yourself need from FMIs when it comes to taking comfort that they have done their job, they have efficient resilience programs in place, and what's your involvement and role within that?
Right. So first of all, thanks for having me. And this question, what do you want? It's so broad. So I think I'll start with a short anecdote, an example, to illustrate our desires, essentially. You see, there is a very curious document contained within the Yale University Library. It's a small piece of goat skin, but obviously it's not just goat skin, it's a bond issued in 1648 by one of the water boards in the Netherlands. But that's not the most curious part. The most curious part is that it is a perpetual bond and it still pays coupons. So once in a few years, Yale University librarians travel to the Netherlands and collect whatever they are owed, even 400 years later. And in short, if I had to sum up what we want from the market infrastructures, we want whatever this is. That is, if we were to persevere for 400 years, we want the infrastructure to still be there. We want the logs, the data, all the information to still be there to support our clients or our clients' grandchildren, right? So in short, what we want is for the infrastructure to be sustainable. However, I do believe that over the last years, the meaning of the term sustainable has been somewhat distorted. Because nowadays, when we talk of sustainability, we mean carbon footprint, we mean good policies, we mean treating people equally, and these things are important. But I do not personally think that they really embrace the meaning of sustainability. Because once again, sustainability, we can take the root, it is to sustain. And what does it mean? I just looked it up at the Oxford Dictionary, and it means to weather, undergo, or suffer something especially negative, like an injury. So sustainability is actually an ability to weather the blows of fate. And some of my colleagues from Jordan and from Clearstream has already mentioned that responsibility is a major part. However, before you're even able to respond, you have to assess the situation, you have to regain your composure, and that's where sustainability comes into play. So, in my opinion, sustainability in terms of market infrastructure is mostly, but not only, obviously, a psychological thing. That is, very often we're faced with disasters way beyond human understanding, such as armed conflict, such as natural disasters. And obviously, these things prompt an immediate emotional response. Like, let's do something to fix it, right? Whatever. But very often, this response is simply wrong. And very often, when we respond emotionally, we produce more issues in the long term than we solve by putting this clutch into the system, right? For instance, an armed conflict might prompt you to impose a freeze on assets, but of some country, doesn't matter. But if it creates a legal conundrum and a political conundrum that perseveres for years, perhaps it was not the best decisions. It should have been better pondered, better assessed as a starting point. So I believe that this emotional resilience, even though emotions are not usually applied to institutions, is an extremely important aspect of the resilience overall. And we're first talking about building trust between the market participants and the institutions. This emotional stability is very important. I'd like to sum up with a quote, not verbatim, from Winston Churchill, who said once that doing everything possible is meaningless. You should be able to do the necessary. Once again, I understand it's very hard to distinguish between the two, but we have no two ways about it, because we cannot afford to fix the short-term problems by creating a plethora of long-term problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Mikhail. Yes, Beverley.
Maybe I'd just like to make a point as well, is that we're focusing on the resilience of the CSDs. We're focusing on the resilience of the FMIs. Understanding the interconnectedness is we need to understand that players in our ecosystem may not be as resilient as us, whether that's a vendor or a participant. So in part of your planning, it's how, because we've spoken about the trust and that CSDs are the custodians of trust. So if there is a extreme but plausible event that occurs of which you have no control, there is an expectation that people can trust that the CSD can still continue to operate and execute on their mandate. But there's a player that was not resilient. How do we build a solution that manages that risk event? So for example, the next simulation South Africa is running is in February, and we had a look. Our markets are small in comparison to some of my delegates next to me. We have 9 participants. Largely they are our big banks. Lehman's example, if one of our big banks fail, and you can never say too big to fail, but for example, if one of our banks fail and they have 40% market share, and by failure here, I mean a liquidation, a curatorship of a bank, a business rescue. The definition of failure is there's no more cash. How do you execute DVP against a player in your ecosystem that has no cash to honor those obligations? You as a CSD need to still execute on settlements. They may have been the custodian of an issuer that's due to execute on a cash entitlement event. If that cash is gone, the market wants you to still protect the investor. How do you do that in a scenario when one of your ecosystem players has not been resilient, but people trust you to still keep a stable market?
Fantastic comment there, because actually I had a statistic that I was planning to quote later for a question, but I think it fits very nicely here. So the ECB did a survey last year of 109 significant institutions. So these would be systemically important banks in Europe. And they looked at their outsourcing arrangements. And what they found out, one of the conclusions was that out of the outsourced critical functions, 20% of those would not be able to be reintegrated within the bank, and 5% of those would not be able to substitute them at all. So you have 25% of outsourced critical functions by significant institutions that if something goes wrong, they can't really do anything about it. But if I continue with what you just mentioned, so do FMIs, do they have to go as far as look into their participants' vulnerabilities and take these into account within their operational resilience plans?
Beverley, just to give an example, I know your market is bigger than ours and their markets are bigger than yours, but in that context, we have about 130 participants who actually actively play in the market, albeit in small portions. When we built the STP across the market in terms of connectivity between when the investor makes an investment or gives an order until it's settled and goes back to the registrar and all of that, what we realized was that we wanted to build a SOC internally, but we realized that we couldn't because of the interconnectivity and dependence of others, so we outsourced the SOC. Now, in outsourcing the SOC, we took all of the if you like, intermediaries and added them on the SOC for monitoring. So all the SIMs have been monitored, everything's been monitored from a central basis. So that's one of the things that market infrastructures, if they have capacity, is to tag along or bring along the if you like, the whole chain with them in terms of certain aspects of what you need to do. For example, the SOC, you know, putting them there, being monitored, because independently they might not be able to do it. They don't have the capacity or the money to actually be able to afford that. But by extension, it means that they're bringing risk to the market and by extension to us. And so some of these things, even though it's in a smaller markets, but I believe that market infrastructures would have to co-tag or go along, or at least be influential in how, you know, the ecosystem works from a connectivity and vulnerability perspective.
Fantastic. So Yes, Mark, did you want to?
I was going to say that, I mean, the case for doing due diligence, so to speak, op-risk due diligence on your own participants is having curious history. But there is an example of it, a very salient example, which was the attack on the Bank of Bangladesh in 2017. Now, what's germane about that story is that obviously there was a cyber attack on Bank of Bangladesh. There was not a cyber attack on the New York Fed, and there was not a cyber attack on SWIFT. But who had a problem as a result of that? It was SWIFT. And it had a problem because the storyline in the press was somehow that SWIFT had been penetrated, meaning that the systems of Bank of Bangladesh had been subject to an advanced persistent threat. So North Korea had got inside the system. They had managed to work out procedures and so on. So they actually generated a technically valid payment order and addressed that to the Fed via a SWIFT message. So as far as SWIFT was concerned, this was a perfectly valid message. Nonetheless, it was SWIFT that had to go away and put in place, you know, the customer security program with which you will all be familiar. It was SWIFT who had to mitigate a reputational and a regulatory risk as a result of that for an event that was not even on its own perimeter. And that's a very interesting story because, generally speaking, the market infrastructure will be a much more interesting story for the regulators and for the press and for the public at large than one small participant might be. So I think it's a cautionary tale. I'm not sure exactly what conclusions we should draw, and we still debate them internally to this day, but it's certainly a question to which you should be thinking of a response, I think.
Fascinating, Mark. I'll bring the next question now, something that Annie mentioned about having a proper regulatory framework, and you mentioned DORA. So perhaps, Mark, I can ask you about DORA being the representative of a European CSD. So how was the experience of implementing DORA? What lessons were learned? Do you think it achieved its goal of bringing kind of incident visibility to the forefront, managing third-party chains? And is it something that we should kind of be recommended to other jurisdictions be?
Well, I think when, Sarah, you were introducing this, it was kind of interesting because you were absolutely going through all the checkpoints in DORA. So arguably DORA is just codifying best practice in terms of what they call information and communication technology risks, whether they are inherent in your own systems or whether you import them through your third-party supplier risks and so on and so forth. However, so you've got your risk management principles, you've got your resilience testing requirements, you've got incident management requirements, you've got third-party risk management requirements and information sharing arrangements. So it's all actually fairly first principles oriented. The problem, as ever, is that firstly, it is relatively prescriptive, and that can lead to potential unintended consequences. So I'll give you an example. I think in the event of a cyber attack, you have 2 hours to notify the regulator. That actually sounds very sensible, but it can also, if you think about it, lead to contagion risk. Is it always going to be appropriate? What constitutes a cyber attack? What kind of impact does it have to have before it becomes notifiable? What happens if that information leaks? What happens if the regulator decides on a containment strategy without understanding the dependencies on that particular actor in the market overall, and so on and so forth. So I think there are parts of DORA which have fallen particularly victim to this European fixation with overly prescriptive as opposed to principles-based regulation. The second thing I would say, and we've said it publicly, so I'll say it again here, is there is one particular supplier of the critical market infrastructures and the banks in the European Union, in the euro area, who is not subject to this and who is excluded from this, who is not considered to be a critical supplier, which is the payment system and Target 2 for securities. So it seems to me that if the aim is resilience, then you should not give people a waiver simply by nature of their ownership, especially when that provider has a pretty shoddy record in terms of continuity.
Fair comment. I think the issues with Target have been very well publicized, and we know that they've had several issues in the past, and they still have some. So I don't want to make this a European kind of political discussion, but very fair points, Mark. When it comes to, because you mentioned contagion risk, and we heard contagion risk being mentioned in the very first panel this morning. It was in the context of DLT. And actually, I think it was Alexander who answered the question, kind of flipped it on its head and said that, oh, you know, you can see it as an alternative system that could help. And there are other new transformative technologies, whether it's AI or the cloud or something that we haven't really heard these days about quantum computing, which could very well be quite a danger to cryptographically encrypted data, but at the same time could work to make things faster or more safe. So what I'm saying is all these new technologies seem to be a double-edged sword. They seem to have a good side and a bad side. So how do you, as FMIs, and that's a question and for the members at the end, for all of you, how do you integrate and kind of future-proof your operational resilience frameworks given all these new and constantly changing technologies? I don't know who wants to go first. I see Sarah is nodding. So.
And I just, yes, thank you, Hannes. Well, just to comment on that, and also to follow on my colleagues' previous discussions, well, it's really important. We can realize, having all those discussions about resilience and about risk factors, we all can conclude that it has to be oriented, first of all, and it has to be adopted by regulators. You did ask the question a couple of minutes ago about do FMIs, do they have to basically enforce this towards all market participants? Because Beverley did mention on their experience, and the answer, I would say yes, because each regulator has his own jurisdiction over certain types. For example, the regulator of the capital market has authority over listed shareholding companies, over listed issuers. The central bank has his authority over banking sector, and so on and so forth. So if each regulator did enforce his regulations, it has to be mandated by law. It's not an option anymore, because as my colleagues did mention, if you jeopardize others, because interconnectedness is really very high in our business and what we do. So if failure to meet requirements to face risk factors would affect the whole ecosystem and the whole capital market and the whole banking sector, the whole payment system, then it's not an option anymore. It has to be mandated, it has to be regulated. I do realize it is different from one jurisdiction to another. There's EU regulations, there are many aspects, but again, looking more seriously at orienting those risk factors, regulating those aspects that could impact certain jurisdictions way more than others is really crucial. And this is when the whole, it would be always complementary to each other. So if each regulator did enforce his rules and regulations, because it's really important to be adopted as mandatory actions, and to be, as also my colleagues did mention, to be tested, not only just put on paper, and to be always dynamic. Because as you mentioned now, Panis, and everyone, it is always evolving, and you need to have always the ability to predict where it's coming, when it's coming, how it's coming, and how you are going to react. And again, become resilient, not to affect the whole capital market and your integrity and sustainability overall.
Okay, and I'd like to add
Yes,
my 2 cents to that, because I believe that the only way to future-proof yourself and your company and the infrastructure against the emerging technologies is to take a very active part in developing this technology, right? Because we are speaking a lot about quantum technologies, quantum computers, completely disrupting our cryptography and such. And we now see lots of market participants, well, not lots, a handful, such as JP Morgan, say, or HSBC, hiring huge teams of PhD researchers just to work on fundamental issues, right? The same thing is happening with AI. Many companies are hiring not just engineers, but actual scientists, right? To further the limit of what we know. And I do believe that R&D spending and R&D investment is the best way to future-proof whatever we have.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I'm conscious of time. We only have 2.5 minutes, and there are a few questions from the audience, and I'll ask the one that I see 2 different people have asked. So it's a catastrophic scenario, I guess. What would an FMI do if both the main and their backup sites go down at the same time? Have you is that part of your plans? Yes, Beverley.
So I can say this because I was a regulator for 16 years, so I can say this. Regulators don't always get it right. An example for Strate is that we have recently been asked by our payments regulator to develop a wind-down plan. So we're asking, what is a wind-down plan? And this is where there is a trigger event, which the regulators can't give me examples, but I assume it's your example of my primary site and my secondary site and my third site go down. Then I must wind down Strate. What does that mean? And what is the time frame? Because it talks existing technologies, new technologies. We know how many years our projects have taken to integrate our ecosystems, whether it's to banks, exchanges, and go up and operationalize our CSDs. So if I wind down my CSD, even if there is another CSD either locally or globally that's licensed, I can't just switch off my switch and switch on your switch. It takes months, if not years, to integrate. So that is an extreme situation, and I don't know the solution. We are busy trying to develop our wind-down plan. I think it comes to, we are systemically important. You have to prevent that scenario from happening. So if there are any CSDs in the room that have developed wind-down plans and know exactly what the trigger event would be, because the worst case is you rematerialize and give everybody back a physical piece of paper because the depository is not allowed to operate and you've lost your license. So I'm not sure.
Mark, is there a comment from you or no?
Well, I'd make the comment that obviously cloud resilience is one mitigation of multiple data center risks, and coming from a very small country where, by definition, physically small, I mean Luxembourg, 80 kilometers by 50, then this issue of a single event failure affecting multiple data centers, and we touched on it earlier with Bank of New York in Manhattan that day, then cloud is a reasonable resolution to that. But, of course, it brings its own risks. For example, it may make you politically vulnerable. So that's one thing. The other point, going back to Bank of New York and your point, is that they did recover it. They recovered it literally, and it's worth retelling the story. They told their staff to go out, to go into any stationery store, any electronic store they could, whatever they had at home, and bring it to a warehouse in New Jersey. And then they got the guys in London to dig through whatever records they have, fax them to the fax machines that people have bought from home and brought into their warehouse in New Jersey. And they rebuilt it entry by entry without having access to any of their own computer records. That was actually possible for a bank, even at that time, that's substantially larger than most market infrastructures, and which resembles most market infrastructures in its core business as well. So, you know, it comes back to what you were saying, Mikhail, when you quoted Churchill. You have to do what is necessary. And the idea that you could write that plan in advance, I tend to agree, is a little bit risible. But, you know, that's perhaps the positive side of the story. My understanding is that that site remains Bank of New York's operation center to this day.
Our time is up. Thank you very much. I think everyone will agree you made this discussion very fascinating with your real-life kind of war stories as well. So thank you very much. This has been very insightful.
Thanks to the speakers and Mr. Panagiotis Kiziris. Let us present you some emerald gifts. Thank you so much. Now